My name is Tessa Black, and today is Wednesday the 27th of November 2019, and I'm in Thetford in Norfolk on behalf of the Norfolk Polish Heritage Group Archive Project to interview a very interesting lady. Good morning. I wonder if you could introduce yourself, please.
My name is Wanda Leahy, but it was Wanda Rozalewicz.
All right, so it sounds as if you are of Polish heritage. Can you tell us how long you've lived in Norfolk?
I've lived in Norfolk for about 50 years, but I was born in Brandon, Suffolk, on the Polish camp in 1949.
Right. Could you tell us something about your father in that case, please?
Yes, my father was Franciszek Rozalewicz, and he was born in July 1919 in Poland, in a town called Walkowiec in Wołyn.
In the county of Wołyn.
Yes, in the county of Wołyn. He was lived with his three brothers and mother and father, and had a farm out in this place, just outside or on the border of the Ukraine, where he remained and stayed and worked on the farm.
Could you tell us your father's parents' names, please?
Yes, I can. It was Jan Bronisława, and my grandmother Rosalind, and that was my grandfather's name. My grandmother, I didn't know her name because she had died and my father had remarried.
Right. I think there's a very interesting photo that we have scanned, which shows a man and two ladies and a baby. Could you tell us the people in the photograph, please? Tell us who they are.
The man is my grandfather on my father's side. The lady to his right was his mother, which would be my great-grandmother. The lady on his left holding the child was his second wife, but the child belonged to his first wife, who had died.
Right. This is a very interesting photograph, historically speaking. Can you tell us what happened to that family grouping apart from the one person?
Yes, they were asked to leave the part of Poland that they lived because it was on the border of the Ukraine, and it was quite a lonely. Well, it was farmland, and they weren't safe, so they were asked to leave and move in closer to the towns where they would be safer. My grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandma and my grandfather refused to do this because they owned the land and it was where they lived. So they were raped. There was rape, there was torture, and then they were murdered. And the young girl that witnessed this was then sent to Siberia, and the house was then burnt down.
Right, this is a very moving story. It was carried out by the Ukrainian Liberation Army, which carried out genocide on a wide scale in Poland at that time, in about 1943, that sort of time. That's a very emotional story for you, isn't it, and your family?
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened to your father at the beginning of the war? What happened to him?
At the beginning of the war, he was still remained, of course, with his parents, but in 1941 he was deported to the Russian army between 1941 and 42. He was, as far as I know, my mother told me that he had a journey in Russia where he was quite ill, and his friend actually helped him and to get through Russia, and then whether they went to Tehran or whether it was Egypt, that he actually joined the Polish army. In 1942 to 1943, he was in the army, had joined the Polish army, and in Italy in 1943 to 1946.
I think one of the medals that you gave us, or showed us, was from Monte Cassino, the big battle at Monte Cassino.
Yes, that's correct. He was through that and survived that.
Yeah. Right, that was a very important battle as far as the Poles were concerned. That's quite a story. But he didn't stay in Italy at the end of the war. What happened next?
We've got some trace that he actually passed through France and then came to England. He actually was still in the Polish army when he was in England. Not sure of the dates he came out of the army, and not really sure what part of England he actually came to when he first came to England. But in 1947, he had met my mum, who was in Italy, but they never met in Italy after the war, and she had come to England as a displaced person. So he lived in wherever he did before. He must have been in Chichester or in Gloucestershire, Cheltenham or Gloucestershire, because that's where my mother was at the time. He then came to Brandon, Suffolk, where he was looking for work and looking for somewhere to live, because there was no running water where they lived. They had to get water from a well in that part of Gloucestershire. And so he came over to Brandon in Suffolk, where he lived in a hostel on the London Road. And then my mum came, he went and fetched my mum, and they made home in Brandon, Suffolk, on the Polish camp.
And that's where you were born?
That's where I was born in 1949. My sister was born in Gloucestershire in 1948.
Right, you've mentioned your mother. Now, she obviously also had to survive the war in some way. Maybe we could return and talk a little bit about her, if you can tell me about her.
Yes, she was born in a small village just outside, probably about an hour, could be an hour and a half journey from Krakow, in a town called Trox, that's still there. It was a small village. She lived on the farm there with her mother. She was the only child. She was the surviving a twin. Her twin sister had died, so she was very close to her mother. When she was 14, name of my grandmother was Hania Jurek Glab. Yes, that's it. Yes, that's on my mother's side. Yes, my mother's. Got my grandmother on my mother's side.
And your mother's name again? Sorry, was?
My mother's name was Leokadia. And at the age of 13 or 14, I can't quite get that date. The Germans had come earlier on in the day and asking that children or anybody of work that could work were going to be picked up that evening at between 9 and 10 o'clock. I can remember my mum telling me that time, between 9 and 10 o'clock.
At night?
At night? At night, yeah. Yes. To make ready for not to have too much clothes, just a little bit to take with them. And they came and took my mum from my grandparents' house. And my mum said that her mum had told her to make out she's got a limp, so they would find that there was something wrong with her, so they wouldn't take her because she was able-bodied. So my mum tried limping, but to no avail. They just took her, and she was then taken to some part in the town and sorted with the rest of people that had been taken, and she was sent to Austria, where she remained during the wartime and worked on a big farm for Austrian farmers at that time.
Do you know from what age the Germans took children?
I heard it was from 10 and upwards.
That's very young.
It was, yes. Anybody that was able, because I don't think it was the beginning of the war. It was toward the ending, not towards the ending. It was probably in 1942 or 43. 42 or 43 that when my mum was taken, so it was sort of near toward, not at the start of the war. And I can remember her telling me stories that when she was at home and still living with her mum, that the Germans had segregated and separated the Jewish people, and my mum was on the farm, and so they had like meat and bread that they made. So she used to run through the forests and go to where the Jewish people were, and they used to do exchange, like they used to exchange food for maybe candles from the Jewish people, maybe a little bit of paraffin or something, and then she used to run all the way through the woods. And when they heard the dogs and the German soldiers, they knew then that they had to head for near the waters, because they would throw anything they had into the rivers rather than the German people would have them. So she used to think how brave she was. She used to say to me, I can't think what possessed me. Now I think of what I'd done as a child. Yeah. And twice she was caught. The first time caught by German people, German soldiers. They took a branch from the tree, stripped it and smacked her with it, whipped her with her, and then sent off, crying to her mum, and because she'd lost everything that they'd done. And then the second time she was caught was the German soldiers had taken her into the town, into the police station, the little town that she was there, and she had to wait to be picked up by her mother.
Oh gosh.
Yes.
Frightening experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And how long did she have to stay in Austria, and what happened at the end of the war?
My mum stayed in Austria till the ending of the war. Everybody was celebrating, and they'd heard through word of mouth by the farm workers and that it'd been liberated and they were freed. And I know she said the farmer that she worked for didn't want them to go. They said that they had to stay. But my mum and a Russian friend at the time made their way. I think they travelled 2 days before they got to the nearest biggest town, wherever it was where they'd been liberated, and there was soldiers to help them on the way to send from there. She went into Italy. But I remember my mum telling me this story about there was a plane crash when she was on the farm, working on the farm for the Austrian farm. It was this plane crash. There was just a rumour that had gone around that the plane had gone down. And she was in the fields and had working and coming back from the land. And she was approached by a soldier. She said the uniform wasn't familiar to her. She didn't know who he was, but he beckoned her, and she was very weary and frightened. And anyway, he beckoned her, and he was coming close to her. He was talking to her. She didn't understand the language. And out of his pocket, he pulled a bar of chocolate. And he gave her this chocolate, and she looked at it. She knew what it was, and she looked at it, and she took it quickly and just ran. And now she got this chocolate, and she was thinking to herself, now, what if it was poisoned? What if there's something wrong with the chocolate? You know, it could be. So she thought, I'll give it to the farmer's children first. So she broke off a little piece of this chocolate, and she gave the farmer's children a little bit. And she thought to herself, well, at least if they're alive in the morning, I can have the rest of the chocolate.
Good for her. Good for her. Oh dear. She sounds quite a character, your mum.
Quite of many little stories that she told me that had happened on
lovely
the way.
anecdotes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Right, we come back to Brandon and your family's life in Norfolk. I gather that your father did meet with an untimely end. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, he worked on Lake and Heath Base as a porter in the kitchens, and he cycled to work, him and his friend, and he was cycling home on March the 2nd in 1956, and he was struck by an American serviceman who was driving the car, and he was killed outright. And at the age of 36 years old.
That's a tragedy after everything that he'd been through, to meet an end like that, and your family.
Yeah, it was hard for my mum. I can remember the funeral, and I can remember little bits and pieces on the day where.
How old were you then when your father died?
I was 7. I was 7 years old when he died, and my sister was 8. My brother was 5, and then my youngest brother Henry was about 18 months old.
Oh, goodness. Your mum was left a widow at a young age with 4 young children to support in a country which is not her home, no family to support her, and not speaking English? Or
yeah, absolutely, just pidgin English as we call it, just to get her through a little bit. But yes, very hard for my mum. Yes, absolutely.
But she's obviously got through it, didn't she? And
yes, she did. She got through it. We were rehoused we lived in a mission hut to start with, and it was 2 families. It was divided into 2. We had the front half, some at the second. I can remember when my brother Henry was born, actually. My dad said to us, "You go and sit outside in the garden and be very, very quiet and look, and then you'll see the stork coming with your brother or your sister, and then you can come in the house and you can see Mum with the baby." So I can remember sitting there looking in the skies for this stork to come with my brother in it.
I think that's a lovely story. And it's so nice that you remember your father, even though you were so young, and you've managed to gather all this documentation and these medals. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came by the medals.
Well, I was asked when I went to the Heritage Centre in Brandon. I met I think his name was Lucas, and he was from Polish descent, and he was very interested in anything to do with the Polish army and that, and they were holding a display of all the Polish armies and some stories about the Polish people in Brandon at that time. And I got talking to him, and he said to me, "Why don't you write it down? Write it down," he said, "and record." He said, "and then give it to me, and I'll rearrange and I'll do it now." So write it so it's not forgotten. So that's what I was planning to do. And I said to Linda, if I come and spend a day with you, you can write it on the computer and we can then do it together. And that's how it was.
Linda, who's Linda?
Linda is my sister-in-law, is married.
Thank you.
To my youngest brother, Henry, yes. And that's what we was going to do. So we was planning to do this when Linda retired, so she had more time, because we knew it was time-consuming. And then I met Tessa in the Polish diner in Thetford. And she said, "No, why do you want to write it down? We can come to your home." So that was how we got to do the story today.
But what about the medals? How did you get those?
Oh, the medals, well, go from the Brandon guy who said to me about writing it down. I then had spoken to a friend who lived in Brandon whose name was Tony Wojtasz. And he had reminded me or told me that there is a place in Ruislip that I can contact that will get to my father's information all about the war and everything. So that's what I did. He'd given me the telephone number. I'd phoned them up first, and they'd put me on to Mr. Grabowski in London somewhere. So I telephoned this Mr. Grabowski and managed to speak to him on that day. And he said to me that the people that I need to be in contact with are the people in Ruislip. And then I was talking to him about medals and things like that, because I said my brothers misplaced my father's Italian medal. And I would like that. Where would I get that from? He said, "I don't know if you'd ever replace it. The only thing is you might find one in a second-hand shop." So it's not the same thing. But he said, when you get back in touch with Ruislip and talk to them, just mention medals, as was my father entitled to any medals, and see where the conversation goes from there. So I phoned back Ruislip, and I spoke to the girl there, who's Monica, and she said that I needed a permission for them to research everything, which I did give, which my sister then gave, because she was the eldest sibling. And they did say that my father was entitled to some medals, 4 medals that had not been claimed, and that I could claim them. And it went from there. So I filled in my form. They sent me details, and then they said about 3 months later, they set up to 3 months for the medals. And lo and behold, the 4 medals that he hadn't claimed were then sent to me, and then I had to sign a little paper saying that they were presented to me as my property now.
That's very interesting that you could do that. I think that might be of interest to other people who might listen to your story at some stage. But to have those lovely shiny medals is nice too, isn't it, for the family and all of you? Well done.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, quite proud.
I think I need to thank you for telling us your very interesting story, multiple stories, lots of layers. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
You're
Goodbye.
very welcome. Thank you, Tessa.